Hey everybody, I'm Angela Walters and welcome to the 5th video in the Mandala Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. Throughout the last 4 videos, we have been working through our mandala panel, starting in the center and working our way out. We've learned how to use echoing and motifs and fillers to create some really beautiful effects. Now in this video, we're actually going to finish up the panel by tackling the teal shapes and the rest of the background area. I'm going to share some tips on how I handle bigger areas of background, and we're going to see things like echoing, motifs, and fillers to create some neat secondary patterns. I'm also going to demonstrate it on a sewing machine and a long arm, so let's get to it. First up, the teal portions of our panel. Now, even though they're shaped a little bit differently than the rest of the colors on the panel, everything we've seen in this video series up to this point still applies to that area. You can use echoing to fill them in, you can use some fillers, all sorts of things. Let me show you what that looks like. If I'm being honest, usually when I'm working through a quilt like this, by the time I get to this point, I'm pretty much done with it. I'm so over the quilt, I just want to be finished. And if I get to that mental place, I know it's time to do some echoing or something that's nice and easy for me. The fact of the matter is, when you're working on your quilts at home, you don't have to do difficult stuff over the whole quilt. Pick 1 or 2 places to really push your wow quilting and then do something easy in the rest of it. At least that's always worked for me. So I'm going to go ahead and add some echo lines in that teal area just to give it a nice consistent look. And then when I'm done with that section, I can travel along that outer fake seam and get to the next one. But if you're thinking, well, Angela, I want to do something a little bit more difficult, something to give it a little bit more of a wow factor. If you're wanting to add some more designs to your teal areas, you can use some different fillers. Maybe throw some pebbles or wishbone in that inner petal. And then I really like the idea of using serpentine lines in the outer area. This teal shape is really stretched out and pointy, and I know that these serpentine lines are going to get right up into that point. Once the teal sections are finished, all that's left to do is to quilt the background area of our quilts. I personally love quilting big background areas on quilts. I love the opportunity that it presents and all the options for designs that you can use. But I know that some quilters can find it a little daunting. But the good news is, it doesn't have to be. Deciding what to quilt in those areas is actually a lot of fun. Whether you purchase the smaller mandala panel or the larger one, I'm going to give you some tips on how to handle areas like these. First up, echoing. In this instance, we're going to use echoing to help separate that center mandala from the background filler. Now, as we saw all the way back in video 1 of this series, when it comes to echoing, there's several different ways you can go about it. Now, on the smaller panel, that mandala in the center runs into the edge of the quilt, which means it gives me a clear start and stop point for my echo lines. Now, for this part, you can use a ruler or not, but if you have the smiley ruler, you might find that it's not quite the right size for the curves of this mandala. But no worries, I'm going to show you how to make it work. So starting at one edge of the area, I'm going to start echoing outside that shape. All I have to do is use this first dashed reference line to help keep me on track. So I'm going to line the reference line up with the edge of the mandala and then quilt along the ruler. But as I progress, if I notice that dashed line isn't on the edge of that mandala, I'm going to adjust it as I go to keep it on track. Making several small adjustments will give us the illusion that it's one continuous smooth curve. Instead of going around the outside of those dark blue teardrops, I'm going to skirt right underneath it and continue on. It's a little bit of slow going and it's going to take a little bit more time, but the result is so worth the effort. Of course, if you're not using a ruler, no worries. You can just freehand this part, or you can go ahead and mark out those lines ahead of time if it helps give you a path to follow. And if you've watched any of the other videos in this series, you've already heard this a million times, but when it comes to quilting those echo lines, I'm looking ahead of where I'm going, I'm trying to keep that line nice and smooth, and I know that when I'm done, even if that echo line isn't perfect, it's going to look great. And I'm going to keep doing that, echoing around the area until I get to the other side of my panel. And I know it might be a little over the top, but I'm going to add a second echo line. And since I'm still using the smiley ruler, I'm going to follow the same steps I did before, except I'm going to line that reference line on the previously quilted line instead of the edge of the mandala. Except this time, I'm not going to have the space to get under that dark blue teardrop. So I'm going to use traveling to help move me to the other side so I can continue on. So what's happening is as I travel around that teardrop, I'm going to have a little bit of an unquilted area right here, and I want to fill that in before I move on. I don't want to leave it and have to come back and take care of it because there's a very good possibility I'm going to forget to do that. It's totally up to you. You don't have to do that. You could even leave it unquilted if you wanted. Once I'm ready, it's back to the echoing. I'm using a dark blue thread so that you can really see those echo lines in the background. However, if you're quilting along with me on the panel, I wouldn't necessarily suggest this color for this area. If you bought the coordinating thread collection, you can use the white or the yellow, or if you're feeling brave, you can use the contrasting thread color to really make it shine. Now on the larger panel, we might have to handle the echoing a little differently. Since the mandala doesn't run into the edge of our area, there's no clear start or stopping point for our echo line. So we have a couple of choices. We could work our way all the way around, coming back to here, and then do our second line. But on a long arm, that's not ideal. That means I'm going to have to advance the quilt back and forth quite a bit just to make it around that mandala. And while that's fine, I don't like to do it. And because I don't like to do it, it's a good reason not to. So instead, on the bigger panel, I'm going to quilt my echo lines in chunks. It's going to allow me to move my way through the area and make it a little bit easier to manage. But even though I'm going to quilt those echo lines in sections because it's easier, I don't want it to look like that's what I've done. So I'm going to find a point to start my quilting that will help disguise those starts and stops and help give me that one continuous overall look. To do that, I'm going to look to this point right here. If I start here, right at the very edge of that dark blue teardrop, I can echo along until I reach the next one, travel along it, and then add another echo. It might sound confusing, but it's actually going to be more efficient to quilt. Once we're finished with that, it's time to see my next favorite technique for dealing with background areas. I like to call this the divide and conquer, where we take a bigger area and break it into more manageable chunks to make it a little bit easier to manage. When it comes to breaking up that background area with the quilting, there's a couple different ways you can go about it. Once I finished the echo lines, I was kind of drawn to that beautiful curvy shape along the outside. Wouldn't it be fun to take that same arc shape and continue it to the corners? Before we start quilting, we need a plan. I don't necessarily have to mark out the whole design, but I definitely want to have an idea of where I'm going to get started. So I'm going to use my smiley ruler, of course, to help me quilt those arcs, but offset it just a bit. Well, what that means is I want the center of my next arc to fall right within this line. If I position my smiley ruler, I can kind of get an idea of where that's going to be. One thing that the smiley ruler doesn't have is a center reference line. So I've used glow line tape to quickly mark that for me. Having that reference line will help me quickly reposition the ruler as I'm quilting. And then once I'm finished with the quilt, I can just take that tape off and move on. I'm going to quilt the arc there and then I'm going to reposition, but the ruler doesn't have quite enough clearance to make it over the top of that teardrop. I can already tell it's too small. I have some options. I could go get a bigger arc ruler, or I can just adjust the way I'm quilting this. And since I'm too lazy to go across the room to get my other ruler, I'm going to stick with the smiley ruler. Instead of trying to quilt that arc over the teardrop, I'm going to reposition it and quilt it so that it just runs into it. It really doesn't matter how we handle these areas as long as we keep it similar on all the sides. Now that I have a plan, let's get started. I'm going to start at that reference point that I marked and I'm going to quilt along the ruler to create that first arc. Then I'm going to reposition and angle the ruler so that it's going to run into that blue teardrop. And then if I want to continue on the other side of that teardrop, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the echo line by traveling along the edge of the area to get to the next point. Once I have my first row of arcs quilted, it's time to decide if I want to echo them or not. Echoing each of the segments is going to help them stand out from each other, especially once we start adding that filler in later. Of course, this is totally optional. Once I have that first row, I'm going to repeat quilting another row of arcs so that they're offset from this one. And this is another one of those times where you can decide how you want to approach it. You can go ahead and quilt all your arcs and all your echoes, then come back later and fill them in, or you can go ahead and fill in this area while you're here. Totally up to you. I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to do though, right? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and fill in that space before I move on. You could quilt the same design in all those sections. You could switch them up and do different designs in each of them. You can quilt each ring of your arc slightly different. It's totally up to you. In this section, I'm quilting an all-over swirly design because, well, that's my favorite go-to design. But in the next area, I think I'm going to switch it up a bit and create a feather type motif using that blue teardrop. Quilting the petals of my feathers so that they extend from the center teardrop is going to help kind of make it look like a motif, give it a slightly different look, and hey, it's just a lot of fun. And even though I'm planning on using several different designs in this background area, it's not going to overwhelm the beautiful center of our quilt if I use a thread color that blends in with that background. I'm using a contrasting thread so you can really see what I'm doing, but I would definitely suggest using a thread color that blends into this area. If you want, you can continue quilting those rows of arcs and filling them in, or you can just do one row and fill in the rest of it with an all over of your choice. For the next row, I'm going to do the same thing, positioning my ruler so that the center of it hits where the two arcs of the prior row come together. And even though we have the best intentions of never letting that ruler move around, we might have to finagle the placement of the ruler just a bit. So on this arc, the center of my ruler isn't quite hitting where those two previous arcs come together. So what I'm going to do is quilt along it a little bit, reposition, and move on. Not only does breaking up that area make it a little bit easier to manage, using the spaces for different designs allows me an opportunity to practice some designs in a small, contained area without committing to using them over the whole quilt. Quilting these arcs so that they're offset from the row before. But there is a slightly easier option if that seems like just a little bit too much to keep track of. I can quilt my rows of arcs so that they echo each other. But we're not talking about a regular 1/4 inch echoing here. I'm going to leave a good couple of inches of space in between those rows so I can come back and fill it in with a design. I'm basically going to quilt the same shape a couple inches away so I have a different shaped area to fill in. A partial arc. And once you run out of area, just stop, and then you can travel and add your echo lines. And in the area between them, you can fill in with a different filler. It's going to give you the same overall look, it just might be a little bit easier than trying to line up the arcs with the previously quilted row. And in this space, you could opt for the same filler you've been using, or switch it up and do something different. This might actually be an easier option on the large mandala, since we're going to have to quilt those arcs all the way around the area. And when you're finished, you have a beautiful quilting design that helps break up that bigger background area and add some interest as well as a secondary pattern. If quilting with rulers and arcs isn't really your thing, I think you're going to love this next design option. We're still going to use that idea of breaking up the space to make it more manageable, except this time we're going to play with the scale of the design to create an interesting effect. It's not only easy because we're using the same design over the whole area, it adds a subtle wow factor by drawing attention to the center of our panel. Plus, it's great practice for getting comfortable quilting our designs in a lot of different sizes. But just like we saw with the arc design, I still need a slight plan of attack. And that's where my trusty marking pen comes into play. I'm going to use this marking pen to mark some registration lines to help keep me on track. I want that change of density or that change of scale of the design to kind of follow the curve of the mandala. So I'm going to mark a gently curving registration line and then a couple more afterwards. Maybe just one right up next to it. Once I have my registration lines, I can begin quilting the design of my choice in different sizes, knowing that the smallest version will go here, and then as I progress through the sections, they'll get bigger and bigger. When it comes to choosing which design to use in these areas, it's totally up to you. Any all-over meandering design will work, whether it's swirls, pebbles, leaves, you name it. Well, now that I have my registration lines marked, let me show you what it looks like when we start quilting this. I'm going to start by quilting that design in that first marked section, and this is going to be the smallest of the designs. And then in each individual ring, it's going to get slightly bigger and bigger. Once I remove those marked lines, I should have this nice gradual change of scale that's just going to help draw attention to the center. When I talk about scale, I'm really talking about the spacing between the lines of the design. If I want something a little bit more dense, I'm going to quilt the lines so they're closer together. If I want them less dense, I'm going to quilt the lines so that they're further apart. So my first section, I'm quilting my swirls so that those lines are about a 1/4 inch apart. But as I cross into the next section, I'm going to start quilting them so that they're almost a 1/2 inch apart. That registration line is just kind of a guide. It's not a barrier. It's not like once I hit that line, I need to change the size of my design. I just know once I cross over, it's time to go a different size. And as I move into the next section, they're going to be even more spread apart. When you're learning a new design, learning how to quilt it in different sizes can be a little tricky. There's a couple things you can do to help keep yourself on track. One thing you might find helpful is to have a little sheet of paper with a little drawing of each of the sizes next to you. It's just going to help give you a visual reference to look at as you quilt. Another thing you can do is look for a real-life object that you can relate to your design. For instance, change, or like money. I can quilt the first section so that my swirls are the size of a penny, and then quilt the next section so that they're the size of a nickel, and so on and so forth. But really, we're just going for that nice, subtle look. Don't overthink it, and don't stress out about it. We're just gonna get it close and move on. Now that we have an idea of just how this goes, let's move over to the long arm and continue it. The reason this works is because our eyes are drawn to a change. We love novelty. Where the design is different, smaller, our eyes tend to go. So I'm using the smaller designs around the mandala to help draw attention to it. But instead of doing small quilting over that whole big area, I'm able to easily transition into bigger designs and be a little bit quicker about the quilting. So it's kind of like a win-win. I get this beautiful subtle texture, and it's much quicker than quilting tiny designs over that whole area. All right, it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed just for this challenge, go ahead and finish the rest of your panel with the designs we learned in this video. You can come up with your own variations, or you can use the techniques I've shown you in this video. I've also put together a free downloadable PDF with quilting diagrams and tips that we've covered in this video. And I'll be back next week with the final video in our series where we'll talk about how to quilt the optional borders for your panel. Until then, everyone, happy quilting. To learn more about this video series or to get any of the products featured in this video, scan the QR code or click the link in the description box below.